of these institutions and these forces that, to a large extent, are arrayed against Eritrea. This is a global system that sees in Eritrea a threat for a number of reasons, because a country that won independence for itself on the battlefield with lives, with blood, and paid a tremendous price for that, has decided to develop itself without listening to anybody else, doing it on its own, doing it its own way. And the point of this is it frightens them. They don't like countries that will do what they believe is best, rather than doing what they're told. But the challenges that Eritrea faces as a result of the many years of war, as a result of sanctions, as a result of all of these vast weapons that the imperial system has arrayed against it, things like food security, agricultural development, healthcare, access to vaccines, preventative treatment, HIV/AIDS reduction, infrastructure development, education, all of these things, you'll never hear them talked about as quote-unquote human rights. Even though, aren't those the fundamental human rights? And isn't that what Eritrea is building? So you'll have people who will come on the stage who will come and speak to you, and they'll tell you, well, things are good and improving in Eritrea, but how come human rights is such a problem? And I would respond, you mean the Millennium Development Goals that Eritrea has achieved? You mean access to clean drinking water, to food security, to agricultural development, to infrastructure development, and to all of these things? Do those not also count as human rights? This is a fundamental question that needs to be posed to this entire so-called nonprofit, so-called human rights complex. Ask them that, and they don't have an answer for you, because their conception of human rights is human rights as they dictate them to you, not as you believe them to be. And that's the important point about this. But again, the question is, so what? What's the big deal? Eritrea is not a terribly large country. You heard people on this very stage saying, well, it's not so strategically important. They don't care so much about Eritrea. But the question is, so then why do they care so much? Why do they want to destroy the country? Because the answer, I think, is quite clear, it's quite obvious. Because Eritrea presents a dangerous, good example. So I want to point out, in 2007, there was a widely read article that came out in the Los Angeles Times, one of the biggest papers in the U.S. The headline read, "Eritrea aspires to be self-reliant, rejecting foreign aid." Now, the article began with the following sentence. I'm quoting it directly. Quote, "This struggling, low-profile nation is doing something virtually unheard of in Africa. It's turning down foreign aid." Close quote. Now, I want you to think just for a second what exactly is being said. That Eritrea is doing something, or this is, of course, 8 years ago now, that Eritrea was doing something unheard of, rejecting aid. In other words, Eritrea said, our national development is in our own hands and no one else's. And because they said that, they put a target on their back, because they took away one of the most potent weapons that the imperial system has for controlling nations, and that is aid. Eritrea's president explained, after rejecting a $200 million aid package from the World Bank, he said, quote, 50 years and billions of dollars in post-colonial international aid have done little to lift Africa from chronic poverty. African societies are crippled societies. You can't keep these people living on handouts because that doesn't change their lives. That's what he said. He said it's... Now you have to understand that when you make a statement like that, you automatically make yourself into the enemy for this system. It's not very difficult to figure out why they hate Eritrea, why they make Eritrea into the vicious monster, quote-unquote, North Korea of Africa, or whatever. And don't get me started on that stupid phrase, because I'll talk to you about North Korea too, but that's a separate issue. Such independence that Eritrea shows is not exactly applauded by neocolonial countries who use debt as a means of controlling nations that present themselves as independent. But are you independent when you're dependent on aid? You've seen all over the continent of Africa, literally from the beginning of the post-colonial period, that when you're dependent on aid, independence is a facade. It doesn't really exist. The great African revolutionary leader Thomas Sankara famously said, quote, "Imperialism is a system of exploitation that occurs not only in the brutal form of those who come with guns to conquer territory. Imperialism often occurs in more subtle forms: a loan, food aid, blackmail. We are fighting this system that allows a handful of men on earth to rule all of humanity." And they murdered him. Thomas Sankara was removed and killed for precisely that sort of position.